He never imagined his morning coffee would taste like ashes. Michael Carter was a 34-year-old logistics manager at a medium-sized distribution center in Georgia. He was the kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, and cared enough to notice details others overlooked. He didn't crave attention, just respect. A working father who believed in doing things right. So when Michael noticed a recurring safety violation, workers stacking heavy pallets near a live forklift lane, he didn't hesitate to speak up. At the next supervisory meeting, he gently raised the issue. Pallets were falling dangerously close to where people and machinery moved. He suggested a small rerouting plan, nothing dramatic, just common sense. The room went quiet. His supervisor, a man 10 years his senior, cleared his throat. "Michael, you've only been here a year," he said. "We've been doing it this way for a decade." Michael nodded. "I know. But I also know someone could get hurt." A shift manager muttered something about rocking the boat. The tone shifted. Sharp, tense. That afternoon, Michael's badge access expired. He couldn't clock in. He called HR but got voicemail. He went, in person, and was met by the supervisor. "You're fired," he said flatly. "For speaking up?" Michael asked, disbelief lacing his voice. The supervisor sighed. "We call it insubordination." Michael walked out with his hands shaking, the weight of a single word, insubordination, crushing his chest. He had spoken up not for himself but for those who might not have a voice. He didn't feel brave. He felt afraid, and suddenly he felt alone. The local news picked up the story. Warehouse manager fired after safety warning. Small mention. Few clicks. But the union rep saw a pattern. Complaints dismissed. Safety audits ignored. Michael joined forces with her. They filed a wrongful termination suit citing whistleblower protection, claiming Michael was penalized for raising legitimate safety concerns. The trial was 6 months later, in a small county courthouse. Michael, still wearing the worn polo he'd brought to the first meeting, took the stand. He spoke slowly, deliberately, not with anger, but with a calm he'd practiced in front of the mirror nights before. "I'm not here for revenge," he said. "I'm here because no one should fear losing their job for saving someone's life." He described working nights, listening for crashes. He shared the anxiety that kept him awake, imagining a coworker hurt because he stayed silent. He walked with his hands in his pockets, quiet, thoughtful, mindful. The defense painted him as difficult, troublemaker, someone who chose confrontation over cooperation. They played internal emails where he'd said he was concerned. They called safety checks overzealous. Then came the compelling evidence. A safety audit from another facility where the same company had lost a worker to an accident. A note from a supervisor elsewhere acknowledging Michael's suggestion had been right and expensive to ignore. Most powerful, leaked internal memos, where the company decided to push back on safety advocates to protect profits. In the jury room, 12 faces stared at those documents in silence. Hours passed. They debated not just facts, but values. They asked, did Michael deserve to lose everything for doing the right thing? They returned with a verdict that stunned the courtroom for the plaintiff. Michael's eyes filled, not with triumph, but relief. Not innocence, but the validation that his voice mattered. That seeing danger and speaking truth was not insubordination. It was responsibility. Remember this: courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers. It shows up in meetings and says, "What about our people?" It doesn't demand applause. It just demands attention. If you've ever held back your truth to avoid trouble, ask yourself, what could you prevent by speaking up? What could you lose by staying silent? Michael's story didn't end with the verdict. It rippled. Contracts changed. Training programs were updated. The company established an anonymous hotline. Managers hesitated before silencing voices again. Michael went back to logistics, but only after his company voluntarily rehired him, offered him training budget, and asked for his input on safety protocols. He didn't return with bitterness. He returned with clarity. He told his son one night, "I lost a job, but I didn't lose my integrity. If a job asks you to compromise your values, you don't need it." Self-discipline isn't just about routines or habits. It's about staying true to yourself when nothing else expects you to. Mindfulness isn't just quiet moments. It's the presence you bring when lives tag along your words. Meaningful growth happens when you choose courage over comfort, justice over convenience. Michael's legacy is not a news headline. It's a culture shift in a warehouse, a safer break room, a family that sleeps easier because a father stood up, because the jury knew the truth, and the world paid attention. Michael never expected his story to grow beyond courthouse walls. Yet, slowly, change began to unfold far from the jury room. Local TV stations covered the new safety policies. Workers shared their own stories of near misses, moments they'd thought twice before speaking up because Michael showed them they weren't alone. Industry associations held conferences, using his case as a model for proactive safety culture. He was invited to speak at one such event. Before a room of hundreds, he looked out and saw faces he didn't know but understood, all the quiet workers who dared to whisper, "Something's wrong." Back home, life felt different too. Each morning as he rolled over to say goodbye to his young daughter, she would reach for him and whisper, "Papa, you're my hero." It wasn't glory he wanted. It was recognition that standing up matters, even when no one sees. Over time, Michael became a mentor in his field. He'd review safety reports for other facilities free of charge, always reminding managers, "Your job isn't done when profits rise. It's only done when you can sleep at night knowing no one got hurt." His voice turned into a standard for leadership, though he sought no praise. The change that fueled him most was in his team. One of the young warehouse workers, quiet, reserved, approached Michael during a break. "I've seen how you handled it," he said. "Next time I see something unsafe, I'll tell you. Thanks for making a place where I can." Michael's heart swelled. Courage creates courage. He didn't see his journey as over. One afternoon, he looked at the company's new policy binder and found his name printed. Michael Carter Safety, Champion Award. He thought of himself in that first meeting, voice wobbling. He thought of the jury returning to him. He thought of his daughter calling him hero. And for the first time in months, he believed it. Courage isn't about facing found dangers. It's about preparing others to do the same. So when recruiters started calling from other companies, offering Fortune 500 roles, he said no. This place needed him more. So did his son and the quiet army of workers now waking up and saying, "I'll see things, I'll speak, I'll act." Because one man showed them that speaking up isn't rebellion, it's responsibility. Self-discipline wasn't just holding fast to standards, it was living those standards every day, even when the world preferred soft silence. Mindfulness wasn't just stillness, it was wakefulness in the face of risk. And meaningful growth wasn't about accolades, it was about creating legacies of safety, respect, and courage. Michael's journey continues, quiet, purposeful, visible in every life he touched in that distribution center and beyond. And it reminds us all, when the jury knows the truth, justice isn't just a verdict, it's a momentum. His name was no longer just an entry on court records or a whisper among staff meetings. It became a standard. Michael's journey continued in the small, almost invisible ways that define real leadership. He didn't need titles or applause. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere. New employees, young, unsure, eager to prove themselves, felt something different when he walked the floor. Not fear, not hierarchy, just trust. He'd walk the warehouse with a clipboard in one hand, not to police, but to listen. He took notes when someone mentioned faulty wiring or broken shelving. He followed up. He checked in. He remembered birthdays. He asked about families. His leadership was holistic, rooted not in policy but in presence, and slowly the culture changed. People who had once been afraid to speak started forming committees. Employees volunteered for safety teams. They made signs. If it doesn't feel right, stop and speak. They didn't need permission anymore. They had permission because of the precedent Michael set. He started offering workshops, unpaid, after hours. How to Speak Up Without Fear became a monthly session. It filled up every time. Not because it was mandatory, but because people were hungry for what he offered: confidence, strategy, and quiet strength. One of the most profound shifts came when a forklift driver, James, who had worked there longer than Michael, confessed during a break, "I used to think silence was survival. You taught me it's surrender." That hit Michael hard, because he knew that mindset. He'd lived in it. And now, someone else had walked out of that prison because Michael had left the door open. The company's CEO visited the facility one morning and asked to meet him personally. They'd never had a face-to-face. She shook his hand and said, "You didn't just help us avoid a lawsuit. You helped us become the company we always claimed to be." Still, Michael didn't let the praise go to his head. That afternoon, he was back reviewing loading protocols with a junior tech. No press releases, no headlines, just the same old clipboard, the same attention to detail. Years later, when he was invited to Washington, D.C. to speak before a labor safety board, Michael hesitated. He wasn't a public speaker, he told them, but his daughter, now a teenager, nudged him. "You tell me to be brave every day, Dad. Time to show me again." So, he stood before a packed hearing, shared his story, and ended with this: "Speaking up cost me a job, but staying silent would have cost someone their life. And that's not a trade I'm willing to make." The applause was thunderous, but Michael barely heard it. He was thinking about the workers still in silence, still afraid, still unsure, if their truth mattered, and that's why he kept going. Because justice, real justice, doesn't stop at a jury's decision. It ripples through time, in the safer handrails, the better lighting, the confident voices of workers who now knew they had the right to speak. Michael didn't change the world in one day, but he did change one workplace, then another, and somewhere out there, someone is walking into a new job where safety is a given, where voices are heard, and where courage is contagious. All because one man once said, "This isn't right." That is the legacy of speaking up. Michael returned from Washington with a quiet resolve. He wasn't chasing platforms or recognition. He'd seen what mattered most, not the applause, not the spotlight, but the courage sparked in others. And now, more than ever, he realized that his story was no longer just his own. One afternoon, a letter arrived at his doorstep. It wasn't from a law office or a government board. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, the envelope creased. It read, "Dear Mr. Bennett, I was in the audience during your testimony in D.C. My name is Angela, and I'm a school janitor in a small town in North Carolina. I've been scared to speak out about some unsafe conditions at our school because every time I tried, they brushed me off. But after hearing your story, I reported the mold growing in the elementary wing. They shut it down the next day. My daughter has asthma. That mold could have killed her. You saved her life and you didn't even know it. Thank you. Angela M." Michael read it once, then again, and again. He folded the letter carefully, like it was something sacred. Because to him, it was. The fight for justice wasn't always about courtrooms and juries. Sometimes it was in the unseen courage of people like Angela, who stood tall because someone else had stood first. Michael began receiving more letters. A single mother in Ohio, a young man working graveyard shifts in a cold storage plant, in Minnesota. A bilingual worker in Texas who finally found the courage to speak up for his co-workers. They weren't just thanking him, they were continuing his story. That's when Michael realized his voice had become a bridge, a path for others, to find their own, and it wasn't his job to walk that path alone anymore. It was to keep clearing it. So he started recording simple messages online. Not flashy, not viral. Just him, his phone, and his truth. Stories of what he'd seen. Encouragement for those who still felt powerless. Reminders that bravery doesn't require perfection, just presence. Within months, his videos were being shared in training sessions, classrooms, even HR meetings. He got messages from supervisors asking how to build better cultures. From union reps asking him to speak to their members. From teenagers who had witnessed injustice at their first jobs and didn't know what to do until they found his story. One day, he walked into his old warehouse, now renovated, freshly lit, clean, and humming with new energy. A large mural had been painted in the break room. It showed a worker standing tall in front of a shadowed figure, and underneath it, bold words. One voice can build a movement. No one said a word. They didn't have to. Michael smiled, nodded, once and stood in the middle of that room where years ago fear had silenced so many. Now it echoed with respect. Not long after, Michael was approached by a non-profit seeking to build a nationwide campaign for workplace courage. They asked him to help lead it. He hesitated. Not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to be sure it would serve the people on the ground, not just the idea of them. He asked them one question. Will the janitor in North Carolina matter as much to you as the CEO in New York? When they answered yes, and proved it, he agreed. Over the next few years, Michael helped develop policies, training programs, and mentorship initiatives that reached thousands. From factories to fast food, from call centers to classrooms, his blueprint for building brave spaces traveled far beyond his hometown, but he never stopped returning to where it all began. That warehouse, now a national model for safety and employee empowerment. Every year, on the anniversary of his firing, he stood in front of a new class of hires and told them the same thing. This place used to run on silence. Now it runs on truth. And that's because people like you have the courage to speak. Some years he cried. Some years he didn't. But every time someone in that group would come up after and say, "Thank you for going first," and Michael would smile, pat their shoulder and say, "Now it's your turn." That is what legacy looks like. Not the fame, not the headlines, but the way one act of courage becomes a map for others. Michael didn't change the system with rage. He changed it with resolve, with honesty, with patience, and with faith that even when the world seems blind to injustice, truth still has a voice, and that voice can still win. He was fired for speaking up, but the jury knew the truth. And now, so does the world. Years passed, and Michael Bennett's name slowly became more than a headline. It became a lesson, taught in seminars, referenced in policy handbooks, spoken aloud in board meetings when decisions were hard and ethics were fragile. But Michael never let it get to his head. In fact, he kept a photo taped to his refrigerator. Not of the courthouse, not of the press conference, but of the old break room, with flickering lights and water-stained ceilings. It reminded him where he came from, reminded him of the men and women who whispered "thank you" when he packed his things and walked out for the last time. That image kept him grounded, and grounding was necessary, especially as the years brought more challenges. He wasn't immune to burnout. There were moments he wanted to retreat, to disappear into a quiet, anonymous life where justice wasn't his responsibility. But every time, something pulled him back. A call, a letter, a teenager seeking advice, a mother afraid to lose her job for doing the right thing. He couldn't turn away. One snowy January, Michael visited a community college where students were studying workplace ethics and labor history. He was invited to speak, not as a celebrity, but as someone whose life represented the truth behind the textbooks. The students, most of them first generation, sat wide-eyed as he spoke. But it was during the Q&A that the room shifted. A young woman with braids and nervous hands stood and asked, "Mr. Bennett, when you got fired, weren't you scared? I mean, how did you know it would work out?" Michael paused. Then he leaned forward and said, "I didn't. I didn't know anything would work out. I didn't know if I'd find another job, if the jury would listen, or if I'd be laughed out of the room. But I knew this. I couldn't let fear speak louder than my conscience. Even if I lost everything, I needed to keep my soul." Silence followed. A silence of understanding. A silence that said, "That's the lesson we came for." After the event, the professor approached Michael and asked if they could name the campus's new ethics initiative after him. Michael declined. "Name it after the people no one saw," he said. "The ones who didn't make the news. Call it the workers, light or something. Because that's what they are, the light in places most people never bother to look." And that's exactly what they did. The Workers' Light Initiative became a multi-campus program that trained thousands in workplace advocacy, ethical leadership, and courage-building communication. Back in Michael's hometown, things changed too. The warehouse where he once worked was now the state's first certified employee-owned distribution center. Not perfect, no place ever is, but transparent, fair, and built on the voices of its workers. They even created a small justice room, a quiet space with a plaque on the wall that read, "This space exists because one man chose truth over silence." Michael rarely entered that room. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't want the story to become about him. He wanted the room to serve those who needed the courage he once searched for in silence. One afternoon, a woman approached him outside a coffee shop. She was in her late 40s, dressed in scrubs, and looked exhausted but proud. She introduced herself as Valerie. "You probably don't remember me," she said, "but I worked in the packaging area when you got fired." I didn't say anything then. I was scared. I had kids, no backup. But I watched you stand up for all of us. That gave me time to find my courage. Took a while, but I used it. She handed him a small card. It was her graduation photo. She'd just earned her nursing degree. Michael looked at her, his eyes misting. "Valerie, you don't owe me anything." "I know," she said, smiling. "But I owe the world the same courage you showed me." That was Michael's legacy. Not monuments, not money, not power. His legacy was a ripple, one voice echoing into thousands. Years later, when Michael grew older and the world began to move faster than he could follow, a new generation picked up the torch. They found his story online, watched his interviews, read the books written about his case. But more than anything, they saw the humanity behind the headlines. Not a perfect man, but a real one. Flawed, frightened, brave, and bold all at once. And that gave them permission to be the same. At Michael's retirement gathering, and a small affair held in the very room where he once stood alone, he looked around at the faces of co-workers, activists, students, and friends. Many had come from far away just to say one thing: "You made me believe I could speak." Michael stood, cleared his throat, and said softly, "If all I've done is remind you of your own power, then my life has been worth it." No. Applause followed, just nods. And tears, because they knew. He wasn't just speaking to them, he was speaking to the world. Let's continue with a heartfelt epilogue to close Michael's journey. Years after that quiet gathering, Michael's health began to decline. Age had crept in slowly, not as punishment, but as a gentle reminder that even those who carried the world on their shoulders needed rest. He spent more time in his garden, tending to plants the way he once tended to people, with patience, intention, and a deep respect for growth. He lived alone, by choice, in a modest home on the outskirts of the city. The front porch faced the sunrise, and each morning Michael sat there with a mug of coffee, watching the sky change. It became his ritual, a moment of reflection, a reminder that no matter how dark the night, light always returned. One morning, a letter arrived. It was handwritten, in neat cursive, and postmarked from another state. Inside was a photo of a young man standing at a courthouse podium, flanked by community leaders. He held a folder in one hand and a microphone in the other. On the back of the photo were 6 words: "Your voice made room for mine." Michael held the image close, a smile forming at the corners of his mouth. That single sentence echoed louder than any speech, louder than any verdict. He hadn't changed the whole world, but he had changed someone's, and that, in the end, was everything. In the final months of his life, Michael kept journals. Not of the court case or the media frenzy, but of conversations, little moments. A janitor telling him she finally felt heard. A manager who decided to stop punishing whistleblowers and start protecting them. A student who turned her trauma into poetry that won awards. His entries were short, simple. Today, justice looked like a handshake. Someone cried in the hallway. I listened. They're still trying, so am I. When he passed, there were no grand ceremonies, no televised tributes, just a line of people outside the little community center where he once volunteered, each holding a flower, a note, or a memory. Inside the center, a simple display stood in the corner, a photo of Michael, a copy of the lawsuit transcript, his badge from his first job. And on the wall above, painted in clean, bold strokes, "Truth is not a weapon, it's a light." Years later, children would walk past that corner. Some would ask who he was, others would already know. And every once, in a while, someone would pause, stare a little longer, and feel something rise within them. A question, a conviction, a beginning. And in that quiet moment, Michael would live again, not in name, but in the courage of another voice, ready to speak. It happened slowly, in the quiet corners of courtrooms and classrooms, where truth still mattered. A young woman raised her hand in a meeting and asked why the lowest-paid workers weren't in the conversation. A delivery driver, wrongfully dismissed, cited Michael's case in a labor complaint and won. A college student who read about the verdict in an ethics course wrote her thesis on moral courage in the workplace and ended up advising a senator on labor rights reform. These weren't headlines, they weren't trending topics, but they were echoes, steady, unshakable ripples from a man who once stood alone, trembling but firm, because silence had become too painful. Years later, in a crowded auditorium where a nonprofit was celebrating its 25th anniversary, a speaker took the stage. She was a former factory worker turned community organizer. Her voice, rich with experience and conviction, carried across the room. "When I was scared to speak up," she said, "I remembered Michael. I remembered what he lost, and what we gained because of it." The crowd was silent. Then came the applause. And for a brief second it was as if Michael himself was there, not in body but in the strength he had lent to so many others. Justice had not been a destination for him. It had been a commitment, messy, imperfect, and often unpaid. But it endured, in the habits of people who no longer looked the other way, in the systems slowly shifting under the weight of collective demands, in the families who taught their children that right was still worth defending, and in every heart that chose courage over comfort. Michael's story was never really about a court case. It was about choice. The choice to speak up even when afraid, to act even when unsure, to believe. That truth still matters, even when the world seems to disagree. He reminded us that our lives, our real, messy, beautiful lives, are not measured by applause or promotions, but by the quiet moments when we choose integrity over indifference. That's how change begins. That's how it continues. And long after the case files fade and the articles are archived, the lesson remains. Speak when it counts. Stand when it's hard, and know, deep down, that you matter. Even years later, when the courtroom was long silent, and the company had rebranded, the story of Michael quietly persisted. It wasn't through statues or parades. It was in the decisions people made when nobody was watching. It was in the employee who stayed late to help a struggling coworker, even though it wasn't in their job description, because they remembered how Michael had stepped up when no one else would. It was in the whistleblower who documented the truth, not for revenge or reward, but because they knew that silence enables injustice. It was in the quiet conversations between parents and children when they explained why integrity matters, using Michael's story as proof that doing the right thing sometimes comes with a price, but always leaves a mark. At the school named in honor of local changemakers, a plaque bore his name. Not because he was perfect, not because he won the biggest lawsuit in history, but because he reminded an entire community that one voice, backed by truth and persistence, could ripple outward into places he would never see. There, students walked past his name every morning, not knowing the full weight of what he had endured, but carrying pieces of his bravery in the way they challenged unfairness, defended each other, and refused to stay silent. His legacy wasn't in the courtroom transcripts. It was in the courage he awakened in others, and somewhere, in an office that had once silenced him, new policies stood in place, reviewed annually, revised when needed, shaped by the hard-earned lessons of the past. Because Michael dared to speak, because a jury dared to listen, because truth, even when whispered, can outlast the loudest lies, and that what more than any settlement or statement is how justice survives. Years passed. The building where Michael once worked had changed hands twice. The faces inside were new, the policies more refined, and the mission statement freshly engraved on the wall. But there was still something, unspoken yet powerful, lingering, in the air, a culture that had been reborn in the shadow of Michael's truth. It wasn't in slogans or PR campaigns. It was in how the youngest staff members were treated when they raised concerns, in how team leaders listened before dismissing, in how meetings always started with a reminder of shared accountability. That shift, slow, invisible, but lasting, came from one man who refused to stay silent. In a high school 3 states away, a student named Isaiah stood at the front of his civics class, delivering a presentation titled, "Speaking Up Isn't Easy, but It's Necessary." His research had started as a school assignment, but it had turned into something more personal when he stumbled across a video of Michael's court testimony. He didn't know why it struck him so deeply, only that something in Michael's eyes, in his calm defiance, reminded Isaiah of his own father. Isaiah's voice trembled as he spoke to his classmates. He was fired. He lost his income. People called him a troublemaker. But he told the truth anyway, and that truth changed everything. The room was silent. Later that day, his teacher pulled him aside. That story, it wasn't just informative, Isaiah. It was powerful. You should think about public service. Isaiah smiled but didn't say anything. He was thinking about more than politics. He was thinking about the courage to stand alone. At a community college in another city, a woman named Amina led a campus workshop on workers' rights. On her laptop was a sticker that read, "Tell the truth even if your voice shakes." When a participant asked about it, she smiled and said, "It's from the story of a man named Michael. Look him up sometime." She didn't tell them she had been working in the same industry when Michael's case made headlines, that she had been terrified, silent, waiting to see what would happen, and that when she saw the jury rule in his favor, Something inside her shifted. She'd never met Michael, but his courage had pushed her into advocacy, into finding her voice, into helping others do the same. In a city council meeting, a representative argued passionately against a proposed ordinance that would limit employee protections. We've seen what happens when whistleblowers are punished. We've learned. We've evolved because people like Michael gave us the roadmap. In homes across the country, parents told their children about a man who was once mocked for doing the right thing, and how, in the end, his truth reshaped the system. And Michael? He had returned to a quieter life. He walked his dog in the mornings. He tended to a small garden. He volunteered once a week at a local shelter where the people didn't care about lawsuits or courtrooms. They just saw a kind man with a listening ear. He didn't talk about the case anymore. He didn't need to. Its impact had taken on a life of its own, in the faces of those who felt seen for the first time, in the hearts of those who risked comfort to do what was right, in the minds of those who remembered him not just as a man who spoke up, but as proof that standing alone, if done in truth, could one day make the whole world stand with you. One afternoon, while browsing the community library, Michael noticed a young man seated in the corner, flipping through a thick binder of legal case studies. The young man had a focused intensity in his eyes, the kind Michael remembered seeing in his own reflection all those years ago. Curious, Michael approached and casually asked, "Studying law?" The young man looked up, startled but respectful. "Yes, sir. Employment law mostly. I'm building a research project for a state competition." Michael nodded. "Tough field. Lot of gray areas." The young man chuckled nervously. "Yeah, but it matters. I'm actually basing my project around a case from about 10 years ago. A man stood up to his company for retaliation after he reported discrimination. He lost everything at first, but then won a historic verdict." Michael's eyes narrowed gently. "What's the man's name?" The young man turned his binder around to show the title page. Michael T. Harris versus Stonebrook. Technologies. Michael's breath caught for just a second. The weight of time, of memory, of everything that had come and gone, pressed softly against his chest. The young man continued, unaware. "I've read his testimony a dozen times. There's this one line. Truth doesn't need an invitation. To the table, it just needs a voice willing to carry it there." That quote, it made me want to pursue justice. Not just for the headline cases, but for the people no one ever hears about. Michael felt something shift in the room, like gravity itself leaning forward to witness this moment. Quietly, he said, "That's a good quote." The young man smiled. "Yeah, I wonder what happened to him. Michael Harris. I tried looking him up, but he sort of disappeared after the trial." Michael paused, looked him in the eyes, and said simply, "He's still around." The young man tilted his head. "You knew him?" Michael gave a gentle nod. "You could say that." Something in the young man's face changed. A flicker of realization, then disbelief, then awe. "Wait, are you—" Michael held up a hand and smiled. "Doesn't matter who I am. What matters is what you're doing with it now." There was silence between them. Not awkward, but full, with meaning, with emotion, with the quiet acknowledgement of legacy. "Keep going," Michael said. "Not because of what I did, but because there are others still waiting to be heard." The young man stood up. "Thank you, sir. Really." Michael nodded and turned to leave, his footsteps light, his heart lighter still. Outside the library, the wind rustled the trees like a whisper, not of the past, but of the future being written in quiet rooms, by brave voices, one truth at a time. Michael walked slowly toward his car, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. He paused at the edge of the lot, watching a group of high school students laugh and chatter as they exited the library. One of them held the door open for an elderly woman behind them, a simple act, yet full of promise. For years, Michael had carried the weight of that courtroom, the sting of betrayal, and the cold silence of colleagues who once called him friend. But in that moment, standing at the edge of the world he once thought had forgotten him, he realized something vital. Justice wasn't just about the verdict, it was about the ripple. One young man, inspired by a quote scribbled in desperation, during a time of fear, had picked up the torch, and through that fire, others would find warmth, guidance, and courage. As Michael turned the key in his ignition and the engine hummed to life, he looked in the rearview mirror, not at the road behind him, but at the reflection of a man who refused to be broken. A man who chose integrity when convenience was easier. A man whose story would outlive the courtroom and echo in hearts far beyond his own. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest justice of all. Michael's story didn't end with the jury's decision or the applause that followed. It lived on in quiet moments, in classrooms where young teachers stood up for silenced voices, in boardrooms where courage finally outweighed convenience, and in dinner-table conversations where children asked, "Why did he speak up even when it cost him everything?" Because truth once spoken doesn't die. It travels, sometimes slowly, but always with purpose. It settles in the hearts of the observant, the brave, and the hopeful. Years later, an article would surface. It described a local community leader mentoring at-risk youth, helping them find confidence in their voices. His name? Michael Davis. He never sought fame. He never wanted revenge. What he wanted, and what he earned, was a world where silence no longer protected the powerful, but empowered the unheard. In the end, the man who was fired for speaking up didn't just win a case, he ignited a movement, not with a megaphone or a riot or a stage, but with truth. Quiet, unwavering truth. What started as a termination, a moment meant to erase him, became the spark that lit conversations across offices, classrooms, dinner tables. People who had once swallowed their voices began to speak. Employees revisited their rights. Communities examined their policies. And across the country, individuals who felt invisible stood a little taller because Michael had dared to be seen. He was not a perfect man. He had his doubts. He had nights where he paced the floors with worry, mornings when the weight of what he'd started felt unbearable. But he kept showing up, not because he wanted attention, but because he understood the cost of silence. And people saw that. They saw his courage, his vulnerability, his unwillingness to trade dignity for comfort. Eventually, organizations that once treated whistleblowers like pariahs began rethinking their structures. Media outlets covered his story. Universities invited him to speak. And when he entered rooms now, he was no longer the man who was fired. He was the man who reminded us what courage looks like. He didn't build a movement with anger. He built it with principle. And it grew because people were tired of pretending things were fine, tired of watching injustice, tired of choosing survival over integrity. Michael reminded all of us, that one voice, spoken clearly and with intention, can become 1,000. He never asked to be a hero. Michael just wanted to do what was right, and that's the part people often overlook. It wasn't some grand ambition or a master plan that led him down this path. It was a simple, almost instinctive reaction to injustice. He saw wrong. He spoke up. He was punished. But in that punishment, something extraordinary happened. The truth didn't disappear. It grew louder. A former colleague once described him like this: Michael didn't set out to fight a system. The system made him a fighter. And that fight, though exhausting and often isolating, reshaped not just his life, but countless others. Quietly, people began reaching out. A woman in HR at another company confessed she had been silenced, too. A young intern admitted she'd almost quit her dream job because of what she saw. A janitor from another city said Michael's story gave him hope he didn't know he needed. None of them were looking for attention. They just wanted to be heard, and Michael had shown them it was possible. The lawsuit dragged on for months. The defense tried every trick: character assassinations, buried evidence, procedural delays. But Michael's truth, documented, detailed, and deeply human, held firm. And with every new delay, the public support grew. It wasn't just about him anymore. People rallied not because he was perfect, but because he was real. Because his pain mirrored their own. Because they were tired of a world where those who did the right thing were punished, while those who manipulated and deceived were protected. And when the jury finally returned their verdict, it wasn't just a legal victory, it was a cultural one. A message was sent. Retaliation would not be tolerated. Truth mattered. Integrity mattered. And in that courtroom, surrounded by cameras and flashing headlines, Michael didn't smile for the reporters. He turned to the quiet people, the ones behind the scenes who'd supported him, the ones who whispered their truths into his inbox, the ones who had no one else to tell. And he said, "This was never just about me. This is about all of us." And so, after the verdict, the courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters chasing deadlines, lawyers packing up, the hum of justice returning to its cold silence. But for Michael, the story didn't end there. That night, back in his modest apartment, surrounded by unopened letters and support messages stacked higher than unpaid bills, he sat quietly, staring at the wall. There were no cheers, no confetti, just the weight of everything he'd carried for so long finally beginning to lift. He looked down at the photo on his coffee table, a picture of his father, a union man who never finished high school but always taught him one thing. You don't have to be loud to be strong. Just be unshakable in what's right. That simple lesson had carried Michael through the storms, through the moment when his manager had leaned in and said, "If you bring this up again, there will be consequences." Through the HR meetings where smiles masked threats. Through the day his badge stopped working and his email was deactivated, without warning. He remembered the morning after he was fired. His wife had made eggs like she always did, her eyes swollen from tears she didn't want him to see. His daughter had asked if he'd be home more now, and he'd forced a smile. But what haunted him the most was the silence that followed. The people who used to greet him in the hallway, now ghosts. The ones who had nodded in agreement during team meetings, suddenly gone. Loyalty, he learned, was often conditional. Yet even in isolation, he found purpose. He spent his nights documenting every email, every meeting note, every out-of-policy action he had witnessed. He filed his lawsuit with trembling hands, not out of vengeance, but because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't. The media didn't pick up the story at first. Why would they? He was just one man against a machine. But justice has a strange rhythm, slow, deliberate, and often quiet before it roars. An investigative journalist stumbled on the case. Then a podcast episode. Then a local news clip. Soon, Michael's story was everywhere. Not because it was sensational, but because it was familiar. People saw themselves in him, the exhausted nurse, the underpaid warehouse worker, the overlooked teacher. And when he won, it felt like they had won. The company issued a carefully worded statement. They neither admitted guilt nor accepted responsibility. But behind closed doors, things changed. Policies were rewritten. The board held uncomfortable meetings. A few key leaders resigned. And Michael? He didn't go back. He chose a different path. He started a foundation, small at first, to support whistleblowers, educate workers on their rights, and offer legal resources to those too afraid to speak up. It wasn't glamorous. Most days were long and underfunded. But every time someone said, "I didn't think I could do this until I heard your story," he remembered why he started. He also became more present with his family, more grounded. He walked his daughter to school. He helped his wife start her small baking business, something she'd always put on hold for his career. They laughed more now, argued less. The tension that had once lived in their walls slowly dissolved. Looking back, he didn't glamorize what he went through. He still had scars, not the visible kind, but the quiet, internal ones that throb when you hear a certain word or walk into a meeting room that feels too familiar. But he also had clarity. He had learned that character isn't built when things go your way. It's forged when the world turns against you and you stand anyway. That courage is often lonely. That doing the right thing rarely brings immediate reward, but in the end, it brings something better. Peace. And as he stood one day, years later, speaking at a labor rights conference to a small crowd of workers, students, and activists, he looked out and smiled. "You don't need a title to lead," he said. "You just need the willingness to lose everything for something that matters." And in that room, packed not with power, but with purpose, Michael's journey continued. Not as a victim, not as a martyr, but as a quiet warrior for truth, the Bao. Following spring, Michael received an invitation he didn't expect, a request to testify before a congressional labor subcommittee. At first, he thought it was a mistake, but the email was clear. They wanted him to speak about corporate retaliation, employee protections, and the mental health toll of workplace injustice. He sat with the decision for days. His wife reminded him gently, "You didn't go through that for nothing. Maybe this is where your voice makes the biggest difference." So he flew to Washington. Capitol Hill was intimidating in its grandeur, marble halls, suited aides bustling from room to room, security checkpoints with faces that didn't smile. But when Michael took his seat at the table, water glass trembling slightly in his hand, he remembered something else his father used to say: "Courage is doing it scared." The room grew quiet as he began to speak. He didn't use complex legal jargon. He spoke plainly about the anxiety, the humiliation, the nights when he questioned his own sanity because people around him acted like what he saw wasn't real. About the morning his daughter asked if he was bad because he didn't have a job anymore. About the dignity that was stripped from him not just by the firing, but by the silence that followed. He talked about how difficult it is for regular people to fight back, the cost, the fear, the years of waiting while bills pile up and friends disappear. And he told the lawmakers sitting before him that policies on paper mean nothing if they don't protect the people who risk everything to speak the truth. The room remained silent when he finished. Then, slowly, applause. Not from the politicians, but from the staffers and guests seated behind him. People who knew, people who had lived it too. After that hearing, things began to shift. A senator cited Michael's testimony in a proposal to strengthen workplace whistleblower protections. A major nonprofit partnered with his foundation to launch a national awareness campaign. And Michael, once an anonymous face in a system too big to fight, became a symbol of what quiet resistance could look like. But he never let it get to his head. He still answered foundation emails himself, still met with workers, one-on-one when they were scared to speak up. He always brought a notebook, always listened more than he talked. One day, a young man named Darren came to see him, fresh out of college, working at a large tech firm. He had uncovered discriminatory practices in hiring but didn't know what to do. Michael heard the fear in his voice, the same uncertainty he once felt. And he didn't tell Darren what to do. He asked questions, he offered tools, and he told him what no one had told him back then. Even if your knees shake, you stand. Darren eventually filed a complaint. It was denied, then appealed, then denied again. But 2 years later, with new evidence, the case reopened. And this time, justice was on his side. Michael watched all this unfold quietly. Proud, yes, but never possessive. He knew the story wasn't his anymore. It belonged to every person who dared to face something bigger than themselves and chose integrity over comfort. At home, his daughter, now older, once asked him during a quiet moment at dinner, "Dad, if they hadn't fired you, do you think you'd be happier?" He paused. "No," he said. "Not happier. Just quieter. But sometimes silence lets the wrong things grow." She nodded like she understood. Then she added, "I think I want to be a lawyer." He smiled. "You'd be a good one." Years passed. His beard grayed, his voice softened. But the fire, the one that pushed him to write his first affidavit, to walk into that courtroom alone, to keep showing up even after the spotlight faded, it never went out. He was never interested in fame. He was interested in fairness. In showing people what accountability looks like. In reminding a distracted world that the most courageous acts often happen far from cameras, in offices, in lunchrooms, in courtrooms that no one ever hears about. Michael once thought losing his job would break him. But it built something stronger, not just in him, but in every person his story touched. And late one night, long after his family was asleep, he sat alone at his desk, writing thank you letters to donors who kept the foundation alive. The yes lamp flickered. The city hummed outside. And as he signed each letter, he didn't think about what he had lost. He thought about what had grown from it: justice, dignity, hope, and a quiet promise. To keep going, one story at a time.